Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss migrants in the United Kingdom and how they're being attacked by the far right. A whole bunch of far right groups have, in fact, united over their anti-migrant stance. Now, of course, migrants, as we know, and slash asylum seekers or refugees, however you want to term them, are being hosted in certain hotels across the country, in specific towns especially. And that, again, is a point of contention for a lot of far right members at this time, saying that they're a migrant invasion, that they've brought crime to those areas, all of which have been disproven by respective law enforcement authorities in those areas. Nevertheless, this is occurring. We've also had a Sudanese teen who died trying to come to the UK via the English Channel. And in fact, that was at some level celebrated, in fact, even by the far right. There's also planned sometime in September in Dover for a far right march against migrants. And there is possibly a pessimistic expectation that there may be violence even during that incident and during that event that will occur in September. Let's discuss all of the above issues with our guests who are joining us today. Joining us from London is Muddassar Ahmed, who is a fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Joining us from Nottingham is Tom Vickers, who is a senior lecturer in sociology at Nottingham Trent University. He's also the author of Borders, Migration and Class in an Age of Crisis and Refugees, Capitalism and the British State. Tom and Muddassar, thank you both for your time today. Muddassar, let me start with you. When there's talk about migrants, and this has happened, of course, across Europe, we've also had other countries where migrant accommodations have been attacked, in fact, set on fire as well. Is that, do you think, the road that the UK is heading down to? Will we possibly see violence towards these migrants?
You know, COVID, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this show. And this is an increasingly important topic, and I'm glad to be discussing it with you here today. I think COVID has exacerbated tensions across Europe in a way that we've not seen before. And the people are very, very angry at our government for a variety of reasons. And this, unfortunately, leads to a situation where existing tensions over migrants has overspilled and become rapidly more dangerous. And I personally would not be surprised if we saw large-scale rioting, a bit like the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, or even if we were to see a lot more violence in this. And sadly, this has been building up for a number of years now. We've been expecting something like this to happen for a very, very long time. It's not new. This country, unfortunately, has a history of violence against minorities, not as bad as many other places, but with COVID, with class divides, with inequality across the UK, these things are becoming a lot more precarious.
Tom, I imagine that this entire situation has not been helped by the like of the current government, right? Where we've had Patel also talking about, having this new position of a channel threat commander put in place and, hyping up this issue of the English Channel crossings. I mean, I imagine all of that is, in fact, hyping up this issue even more, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to recognise that these protests and kind of invasions of hotels by far-right groups are really being fuelled by that kind of propaganda that's coming from the government and sections of the media and also civil servants. So just this week, the Home Office had to withdraw a video they had posted on Twitter from the official Home Office account, which complained about what it called activist lawyers. That it said were delaying and disrupting deportations. And so this is a direct smear against refugees, legal representatives performing their perfectly legitimate role. And to put it in context, this absolutely isn't about a huge surge in the number of refugees coming to Britain. So statistics, the latest immigration statistics that have just come out show there's actually 36% fewer people applying for asylum in Britain over the last quarter than for the same quarter last year. So it's about it becoming harder for refugees to enter the country and claim asylum. And so they're resorting to more dangerous routes. People are becoming more desperate. And some people, politicians, media are seizing on that to whip up racism.
Yeah, so Muddassar, what do you make of the government role here? And of course, not just the government role, but we've also had Nigel Farage and others within politicians who are also seemingly adding fuel to the fire.
Well, look, this government is been a tragicomedy. I mean, this government's role in handling COVID, this government's role in managing our economy, this government doesn't seem to be doing anything right. And, unfortunately, many people have accused this government over the past year or two, and Boris Johnson in particular, of using dog whistle politics and sort of really exasperating racial tensions in the country. This government doesn't have a great track record on defending, anti-Muslim hatred and a number of other issues. So, it's I am very concerned that if this government does not take a serious handle on this issue, they're going to let out a genie from a bottle that you can't put back in. And already we're seeing signs of, as you've mentioned, the far right jumping on this, Nigel Farage jumping on this. And, not only is this a distraction from the real problems facing the country, but it also has a significant potential to make things much, much worse.
Tom, one of the things that just I didn't understand, and maybe you can explain it to me, is the fact that, Paul Golding, I believe, and his group, when they attacked and entered into a facility which was, hosting migrants, one of those hotels, and went room to room, banging on doors, asking those migrants to identify themselves, and a lot of the migrants then, sought cover and tried to hide from them. The police have insisted that no criminal action took place in that incident. I mean, that sort of doesn't make sense, right? Where if you are there and you're threatening people, that should hold some sort of punishment, shouldn't it, to be able to then quell this sort of thing from increasing? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, there's very clear legislation in Britain about threats and intimidation being criminal offences. So yes, it is very concerning that the police were basically prepared to stand by and allow this to be carried out. But it shouldn't come as such a surprise, given the history of police racism in Britain. So you just look at the stop and search figures. So here in Nottingham, where I'm working, if you're black, then you're 7 times as likely to be stopped and searched by the police. If you're of Asian ethnicity, you're twice as likely to be stopped and searched by the police. There's a lot of evidence of deep-rooted systemic racism in the police.
And, Muddassar, all of this is, there's so many rumors right around these migrants and asylum seekers. As I'd put in my introduction, there's rumors about crime. And if we hone in on that for a moment, in one of the towns where these migrants are being hosted, there's just this rumor that crime is increasing. And a lot of people are convinced that is happening. But in fact, law enforcement officials have confirmed that that is not, in fact, the case, that these migrants have not had an effect on crime rates within that region. How concerning is that as well? Because it seems that, we're really having a hard time with this fine line between fact and fiction.
We are, and I think we really need to look at the role of social media, Facebook, WhatsApp videos, and Twitter in helping to facilitate the spread of these rumors. I know that this is a topic that comes up a lot, and it's far more to this than meets the eye. But I would love to see swifter action in quelling these rumors, because that's the only way these rumors are spreading at this moment. Under lockdown, where people, well, not quite under lockdown, but people aren't moving as freely. So Britain First and a lot of these groups are taking advantage of live streaming. I don't know if you saw that video of that live stream where they raided a hotel to look for migrants, and they spoke very passionately about their rationale for doing this sort of thing. I honestly think that we need strict action on making sure that these sorts of things are not being disseminated, and this will help the situation greatly.
And to give you the final word on that topic of social media, right? Because that is, as Muddassar said, of course, a very valid concern as well, where a lot of these rumors, unfounded rumors, are being spread via social media. And then we've had this huge wave of support for many of these videos, these live videos sometimes, as these far-right group members are attacking specific accommodations. How important is it to control all of the above?
I think yes, certainly there are, and some really far-fetched conspiracy theories that seem to be gaining a lot more kind of support on social media. But I think it's important not to be too distracted by what's going on in kind of social media and kind of people sharing this, because the driving force is really kind of coming from government and the state, and the actual kind of violence that is being carried out by the state, which we also, saw another tragic death, as well as you referred to Abdul Fattah Hamdallah, who died drowned in the Channel. But we also had the tragic case of Mercy Baguma in Glasgow this week, a refugee from Uganda who was left destitute and was found dead next to her severely malnourished 1-year-old child. And this is the kind of violence that the state is routinely inflicting on people, and really these far right groups, which are still relatively small in the grand scheme of things, are a sort of reflection and echo of the racist violence of the state. So I think it's important not to get too diverted.
Yeah, point. We'll leave that as our final word, but we appreciate both Tom and Muddassar for their time today, and of course for sharing their insight with us. Certainly this can very quickly become a situation which is uncontrollable. As Muddassar there said, essentially this is the Pandora's box, which if not controlled can get really out of hand. We are coming closer to that September rally by these far-right groups in Dover, and of course it's not just Dover which has been affected by these migrants who are accommodated there in hotels and other such facilities by the government to keep them safe and secure, and of course to be able to have some form of social distancing in the midst of this pandemic. The numbers are low of the migrants, in fact, coming to the UK, especially if you compare those numbers to the Middle East and other countries, even such as Pakistan and others, and the numbers that we host here versus the numbers that are even coming into the UK. I mean, it's exponentially different. Nevertheless, the talk in the UK is of a migrant invasion, of crime by these asylum seekers, and a whole bunch of other negative rhetoric towards them, which is, again, very disturbing, because this can all end up with very, very significant amounts of violence, if not controlled by the government, which only seems to be, in fact, adding fuel to this very racist fire as well. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Canada, and the Canadian Intelligence Agency, i.e. CSIS, has admitted that it gathered intelligence illegally in some cases, when it came to one specific case of a gentleman named Auso Peshtari, who has been accused of being an ISIS recruiter. It's also admitted that, in fact, it held back favorable evidence from being given to Peshtari's defense lawyers, which again then collapses the case in some ways, of course, against this gentleman. When we go down the list of the things that he's accused of and the favorable evidence that has now come forward, it brings into question the entire warrant that was used to, in fact, arrest the man to begin with. And we can talk about him plotting an attack apparently on Parliament Hill in the U.S. Embassy. 2010 affidavit said that, in fact, he was discounting such a plan altogether. Then CSIS also said Peshtari engaged in quote-unquote jihadist training. I dislike the word jihadist, but I'll use it in this case in 2010. But new evidence, in fact, shows that Peshtari was just one of a number of men who were shooting pellet guns, which, again, a lot of people do on a regular basis for for leisure purposes. And then there's an affidavit also saying that Peshtari radicalized, quote unquote, a Muslim convert. But in fact, in 2010, again, an affidavit cast doubt on those alleged recruitment efforts. What does this mean about how we go about, in fact, viewing terror suspects altogether, and whether or not we're willing to actually treat them fairly under any law? No one's to say that he's guilty or innocent, but nevertheless, he has the right to due process, doesn't he? Even within Canadian law or any other law around the world for any respective such person. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Zhou, who is an investigative journalist who focuses on national security and discrimination issues. He's joining us this morning from Toronto. Joining us from Ottawa is Mustafa Amin Farooq, who is the executive director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. Mustafa and Stephen, thank you both for your time this morning. Mustafa, let me start with you. As I read the details and as I put out in my introduction, it becomes more and more disturbing, right? Because it seems like in many ways the case against this gentleman just becomes that much more weak.
Yeah, I think that there's no way of reading Justice O'Reilly's decision and not clearly seeing the great ways in which CSIS has fundamentally failed in its duty. Obviously, I think in general, one would assume that it's a good thing that we have a security agency that's trying to protect us from acts of terror. But the reality is that when CSIS is breaching the law, when CSIS is not doing what it's required to do by law, that is terrifying. It means that you have an agency of government that feels that it can do whatever it wants. And this is not a singular incident that's confined to Mr. Pishtari. In fact, only just about a month ago, the Federal Court of Canada released another decision. This was from Justice Gleeson, and it was a 151-page, just brutal, scathing ruling where Justice Gleeson slammed CSIS for its cavalier institutional approach to the duty of candor and the rule of law. And in that decision, Justice Gleeson talked about how this is just a long-standing pattern that goes back years. And so what that means is that you have an agency that is directly responsible for stopping terror attacks, and that in its dealings with the court, where we have a presumption of innocence, that they have a cavalier institutional approach to its duty of candor. And what that really is showing is that when they get in front of courts, they feel that Muslim Canadian rights matter less. That's it.
Yeah, and Stephen, that's concerning, isn't it? Because as Mustafa there said, certainly all of us would agree that, we want any of the respective countries that we live in and are citizens of to be safe, of course, from any form of terrorism. Nevertheless, if we're creating this if we're othering the Muslim population, for example, that doesn't in fact help that cause, does it?
No, and it's like Mustafa said, in fact, in the decision that he mentioned, I think there is a citation of multiple cases where CSIS essentially displayed that quote-unquote cavalier institutional approach. And I remember reading that, in fact, the first director of CSIS, the very first one, had to actually resign in the 1980s for a kind of similar procedural or /legal screw up, I suppose, in the dealing with the 1985 Air India bombing. So it's not again, there's a large historical context to these decisions, and I think there's a sense that if you're acting on behalf of the Crown or on behalf of the Canadian people or on behalf of protecting people's security and so on and so forth, that you have some kind of protection under this legal doctrine called Crown immunity as a defense against different kinds of criminal liability. And I think this has been mentioned by a lot of observers with regards to CSIS's conduct. But they've been warned before that that's not the case, that they have no such protections. And right now, it does not seem like the oversight structures that we have in place to check CSIS behavior is really has much teeth, and it really amounts to much.
As I was reading again the details, right, one of the things that comes out whenever we're talking about a terrorism case is the fact that creates a lot of hype, right? I mean, there's a lot of negative connotations whenever you're looking at such cases anywhere in the world, in fact, and it's very easy to get caught up in all of that. I mean, as I said, under the law, Pishtari is, as of now, innocent until proven guilty, right? And do you think that sort of gets lost within all these details, that he does have the right to due process, as does any other such person who may be accused of even such a heinous crime?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. I think first of all, the presumption of innocence is something that should be guaranteed to every Canadian under the Charter and under our Constitution. Yeah. But unfortunately, whenever CSIS gets involved, it feels like that presumption of innocence kind of goes out the window. And let me put that really, really clearly. We in Ottawa have an individual who lives here whose name is Mohammed Harakat. Mohammed Harakat was arrested in 2002. That's almost 20 years ago, on suspicions of ties to terrorism, and he was imprisoned under a security certificate. And CSIS alleged that he had entered the country as a sleeper cell agent for Al-Qaeda. Now, the reality is that there has been no court decision because of that security certificate process that actually found or looked at the merits of what CSIS had against him. And so as a result, Mr. Harakat has languished for almost 20 years and to this day continues to do so. And ultimately, that's a failure. That's a failure of our system. That's a failure of advocacy organizations who have not been able to be successful in getting him to be released or to stand trial for what he's apparently accused of. And ultimately, that's a failure for every Canadian because when one person's rights are cheapened, when one person can be detained with really no recourse, that is the failure of all of us.
Indeed, and Steve, the final word before I let both of you go on that point again of innocent until proven guilty, having the right to due process, having your time to defend yourself with the proper facts in front of you, all the facts, as we know, CSIS in this case did not give Pishtari's lawyers access to, initially at least. How important is that? How concerning is that in your opinion?
Well, it's very concerning, but I think it's, speaking about this issue with you guys this morning, it seems like with all that's going on in the world, it's quick for people to forget that Canada, in many ways, is still prosecuting its quote-unquote war on terror. So many years after, the 9/11, we're very much, particularly as a Muslim community, still living in that shadow. And that creates, I think, with these revelations, these damning decisions, it creates a much, an ever expanding chasm of mistrust between law enforcement, between intelligence, between national security agencies. And I think lots of Canadians, most of them in the Muslim community, and who are often sort of like have the spotlight on them. And in that case, not only is it going to get tougher going forward to prosecute this quote unquote war on terror properly, but also you're making it harder on yourself to actually put the people you want to put behind bars. You're just making that more difficult for yourself because you want to cut corners.
Yeah. Exactly, and that's a very good point to end on. We appreciate both Stephen and Mustafa for their time this morning, speaking to us from Toronto and Ottawa, respectively. Again, as I said to one of our guests, it would be easier to, in fact, find allies within the Muslim community in Canada or any other country around the world where you're seeking to actually root out anybody who may even have terrorist leanings, because no one anywhere in the world would want to endanger their own loved ones and family members with having any national security issues or any national security threats amongst your own group. So, I mean, instead of otherizing the community and not, in fact, following due process, that will only hurt the cause of national security. As Stephen there said right at the end, this will only create and make difficulties for the process going forward. Hopefully, as these sorts of things come to light, these sorts of discrepancies in following the proper process, as CSIS has not done in this case of Pishtari, as well as other cases, as Mustafa also mentioned, that have happened in previous years. This only makes their job that much more difficult. And in fact, as I said, every Canadian or every person anywhere in the world would want themselves and their family members to be safe. So let's not create this suspicion, this air of suspicion around people without proving that in a court of law. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Facebook's role in India specifically. And we've had a Facebook executive by the name of Ahmed, who has apologized to Muslim employees for sharing a post back in 2019, which in part called Muslims in India a degenerate community, quote unquote, for whom nothing except purity of religion and implementation of Sharia matter, end quote. Now, that post was not written by Das herself, but was written by a former police officer. That was in response to the anti-CAA protest that we told you about here as well, and it was shared, as I said, back in 2019. Now, there was, of course, a lot of criticism just of that post, but even on top of that, then we had the Wall Street Journal reporting that she had told her employees not to use hate crime speech or hate speech rules, that Facebook follows towards Hindu nationalist individuals, basically the BJP, if we're completely honest, and other such groups. She said that that would damage the company's business prospects in the country. Now, why Das thinks that this is all good policy making for a social media platform, which by definition should be neutral and not allow for any hate speech, of course, defies logic and is beyond understanding, at least at this point in time, for myself and I imagine many, many others. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Zakia Soman, who is the co-founder of Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan, which is the Indian Muslim women's movement. She's joining us now from Ahmedabad. Joining us from London is Mirza Saaib, who is the candidate for Masters in Public Policy at Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford as a Weidenfeld Hoffman Scholar. And joining us from Gurgaon is Seema Guha, who is a freelance journalist. She's worked in the Times of India and as Telegraph as a correspondent covering anti-foreigner agitation in Assam. Seema, Mirza, and Zakia, thank you to all three of you for your time today. So let me start with you. This is a Facebook executive, right? In a country as vast as India, and she's posting these things even back in 2019, which is not that long ago, by the way. Why do you think that she would have thought that that would be okay to even share that? I mean, she says in her defense that she didn't mean to offend Muslims, but it's hard to see how this would not offend Muslims.
See, we are seeing the connection between social media and the kind of populism or the kind of majoritarianism all over the world. And we have to keep in mind that Facebook, in the end, is a business entity which eyes profits. And unfortunately, we are living in an era where hate sells. And there are many people who indulge in hate mongering on social media. And I guess that is what has led to this whole thing. She has forwarded a post by somebody which is, outright qualifies as hate speech, outright qualifies as discriminatory speech, and yet it has got undetected, unpunished, uncalled out so far. It's only when the Wall Street Journal took it up that all this has, arisen into a controversy. So we need to look at this in this perspective.
Seema, what are your thoughts? Because you would think that that Ms. Das, this Facebook India executive, that she would be more careful, right, considering her role and her understanding of that role. Again, as I said, a social media platform such as Facebook, which has been under the spotlight for hate speech around the world. We can talk about Myanmar as well, for example, and the Rohingya hate speech as well. You would think that she would be more careful. Why do you think that she feels that she has the right to be sharing such things?
Simply because nothing is ever done to people like this. I mean, it's a free run for hate speech. Nobody bothers. And at the moment, our television and channels are just busy with the Sushant Singh murder case. All this is not really that important at the moment, because people are just consuming that. And this has become very, very evident in India. You can do what you like and get away with it. What I am shocked is that Facebook is not an Indian company. Why are they doing this? They have rules and regulations for Europe and America. They also put down Donald Trump's tweets sometimes. Yeah. How come in India they're that scared? I really don't know. It's the general atmosphere that you can get away with everything. If the Wall Street Journal had not pointed this out, I don't think anything would have happened, though I must say that Derek O'Brien, one of our MPs from West Bengal, from Mamata Banerjee's party, the Trinamool Congress, raised it in Parliament last year. But it was not really covered much. Nobody bothered till the Wall Street Journal came out with it.
All right, so Mirza, on that point of the Wall Street Journal, right, had it not brought up this issue, do you think that this would have still very much stayed under the radar? And it is dangerous to allow this to sort of simmer, right, under the surface?
Well, of course, it is quite dangerous to allow this to simmer, and this is a slew of cases where we see that Indian watchdogs and Indian agencies that are tasked with the responsibility of policing such discourse have not done their job. It's an international group or a group outside India that has done investigation or found out that certain laws have been violated. But what needs to be understood over here is that activists around the world have long suspected that Facebook is not a content neutral platform, because demagogues have been harnessing the platform to appeal to the most heinous instincts of its users. And in India, this has been blatantly obvious for 7-8 years now, that Facebook has a role to play in politically motivated communal violence, lynching, riots, and the spread of rumors across India by allowing toxic content by BJP leaders as well as their supporters to go unchecked, despite a clear policy of removing such content and banning perpetrators. But inflammatory content by people who are connected to the BJP does not get these accounts banned immediately, nor is the content removed promptly. Anki Das, as you pointed out earlier, she said that if this content was regulated or removed, it would badly impact business in India. Now, such a callous statement effectively shows that she has advocated for selling hate for profit in India, but more importantly, that she is oblivious to the lived experience of Muslims and marginalized communities that are at the receiving end of that hate speech, for whom this content has real-world consequences. So the question that arises is, why does the public policy for politically connected, high-profile users of Facebook, why does that suffer from such a lack of transparency? Why is it so susceptible to political influence? And the answers to these questions indicate that on the Facebook platform, the rules for policing common people are measured by a different yardstick. But if the perpetrator can give the company some profit, or if the perpetrator has political connections, Facebook will turn a blind eye to the violations.
Zakia, now have the Peace and Harmony Committee of the Delhi Assembly, which has said Facebook is not a content-neutral platform, as Mirza there just said, and will, in fact, summon senior Facebook officials, possibly including Anqidas herself as well. Do you think that the Indian Assembly itself will be able to hold Facebook to account? Will there be accountability in this case?
Yeah, so like you pointed out, apart from the Delhi state, there's a parliamentary committee also headed by the parliamentarian Shashi Tharoor. They have also summoned Facebook and they've called for an explanation. But I would slightly differ, from the earlier panelist. I agree with large part of what he says, but I do not agree that there are not enough number of watchdogs in India. There are any number of civil society groups, there are any number of activists, there are any number of journalists who are pointing out what is happening here. But the thing is that large sections of the media have been co-opted by the ruling dispensation, and the media is only following the government line, and that's how these violations don't get highlighted. Let us also accept that Facebook is fundamentally a business entity, and the BJP is amongst the largest advertisers on Facebook out of all the political parties in India. And also, because it is the BJP-led government in power, Facebook looks at India as a market, and they need that kind of a relationship, that kind of a cooperation from the government, and it's mutually beneficial to this private entity and to those who are sitting in the government. And that's how this kind of hate speech goes on uncensored. Right. It is also that hate and Islamophobia has become quite normal now, and it no more raises eyebrows, it no more disturbs people when these kind of things are being said. So we are living in that. Unfortunately, we are living in those kind of times. Yes.
Seema, I'll give you the floor. Unfortunately, the clock is getting the best of us. So tell us, Seema, about what you think will happen now going forward, right? Even Facebook has said there will be an independent investigation, which it will carry out as well into this incident. And of course, the Wall Street Journal is reporting also. Do you finally think that this sort of hate speech online will be controlled? Because again, it has very real world consequences on the ground too, right?
I really can't say. All this will be proved when we have elections in Bihar very soon. Let us see what happens then, how it is used. Will Facebook try to be a little more careful. Yes, for a few days it will be, for a month or so. I think in 2 or 3 months' time we have the Bihar elections. And then, election time, people, the politicians, and especially the BJP with its hate speech, they go completely berserk at that time. Let us see then what happens. They will be a little more careful, I think, but I don't expect any great major change somehow. I don't know. I hope I'm wrong.
Indeed, we all do, of course, but we appreciate all three of our guests for their time today, Seema, Mirza, and Zakia, for sharing their insight on this very important topic. And I wanted to hone in on something that Mirza said, where he said that Facebook is not a content-neutral platform, right? That's something that even the Delhi Assembly's Peace and Harmony Committee, as I said in one of my questions, has also admitted. Now, if you're not a content-neutral platform, then why are you in the business of saying that you are a content-neutral platform? If you are just a business, why has Facebook been sold to the rest of us as something that is meant to be a neutral platform for the rest of us to be able to express our opinions? Again, not when it comes to the fine line of passing into hate speech. That must be controlled for the sake of everybody, because all citizens want to live side by side, ideally in peace and harmony, and especially in a country as vast, as I said, as India, where Muslims live side by side with people of many other ethnicities and faiths. Why would the Indian government, why would the BJP allow for this sort of hate speech to fester? And why would Facebook India's own executive post something which is clearly hateful towards Muslims and then in defense of her post say, oh, I didn't mean to offend Muslims? How can you not expect Muslims to be offended when you call them a degenerate community? I mean, that just defies logic altogether. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.